Hi, my name is Paul Grogan and welcome to episode 68 of the Gaming Rules podcast. In this episode, I am joined by Ben Maddox from 5 Games for Doomsday, and we're going to be talking about narrative in games or narrative-driven games. As always, a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible, and apologies to everybody for the delay of this podcast. It's been a number of weeks since I recorded it, and I just haven't been able to get around to doing the editing. Also, thank you very much to the support of GamesLaw, the UK's largest specialist games retailer, at gameslaw.com. If you want to discuss anything that we talk about in the show with either me or Ben, then there will be a link on my BGG guild, which is Board Game Geek guild number 2258. Head on over there and there will be some discussion about this podcast. Without further ado, let's get on with the show. So welcome back to the show, Ben.
Oh, hello.
It's back again.
You've put a lot of extensions on Gaming Rules Towers now.
More since the last time you were here.
Yeah, it's like a castle now.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So we were going to do this in LyriaCon because we were both there at the time and you had the means of recording it. But then we were both too busy and I was ill and it just didn't happen. So
yeah, I mean, the thing is with a place like that, with all that beer flying around, things get away from you, you know what I mean?
But we're here. So quick introduction for those new listeners to the podcast who don't know who you are. Tell people.
Hello. My name's Ben. I run the 5 Games for Doomsday podcast, which is any similarity to Desert Island Discs is purely coincidental. Mm-hmm. And basically the idea is I get notable board game types and they are fleeing an apocalypse and they only have 5 games they can take with them. And which 5 games do they take? And then we talk about their lives and their loves and their heartbreaks and their successes. And then everyone cries at the end and it's a wonderfully cathartic experience.
And that's found everywhere that you find your normal podcasts.
Yeah, everywhere. Just 5 Games for Doomsday.
But it's the number 5 and the number 4, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
No. If you go to the website, it's 5gamesfordoomsday.com written out.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's only the Twitter handle because they don't let you have that many characters.
Yes. So go and check it out. Some good interviews on there.
Yeah, absolutely amazing interviews. I speak very little, so that's why it's good.
Well, that's apparently one of the skills that interviewers have, which is where because I'm not a skilled interviewer and I end up just talking over my guest all the time. Because I just view it as it's 2 people chatting.
Well, everything you say, Paul, is solid gold, so it's fine. I mean, I'm a boring individual, so it's perfectly fine that you elucidate your profound thoughts.
Well, I've got you on the show to raise the class of the podcast.
Well, I mean, listen to me. Clearly classy.
You still use words I don't understand, like, cat and dog and things like that.
Well, what you don't realise is I permanently have thesaurus.com open at all times. And I just type words in and then I just pick them out at random.
Right. And some of the words you use could be complete nonsense and people like me wouldn't know.
Oh, no, they are. Complete nonsense.
Right. So let's have some complete nonsense words. The topic of discussion is narrative-driven games or just narrative in games. And I remember speaking to you about this like a couple of months ago, saying, I've got an idea for a podcast and I'd like you to be the guest. I can't remember what prompted me. There was definitely something that prompted me to do this, and I can't remember what it was. There was probably some discussion going on social media with people complaining and ranting about it. I thought, I'm going to give my 2 pence worth on that.
Yeah.
So what is a narrative-driven game? But before we start, just a reminder, anything we say in the next half hour is purely mine and Ben's opinion. I'm going to be vocalising things as if it's fact.
No, that's not right. Anything I say is demonstrable fact.
Right.
And if you disagree with me, even on the slightest nuance, you're wrong.
Right. Whereas me, anything I say is just my opinion. But the way that I will word it, I will come across very headstrong and passionate, as if I'm telling you it as fact, but I'm not. Whereas what Ben says is fact.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's this thing, right? If stuff comes out of your mouth, clearly it's your opinion. And I appreciate why you're making the disclaimer because of the nature of the internet and what people are like.
Yeah.
And I go, you said this, and it's like, well, look, it's coming out of my mouth. I don't have a string of letters after my name. It's clearly I'm just some other bloke on the internet putting his opinion forth. I'm as much of a chancer as anyone else. Don't be offended and say that I'm
wrong.
putting you into a corner, because you can contradict me as much as you want. But fundamentally, I'm right. That's science.
I mean, we'll delete all of those comments that people put if they disagree with you. We'll delete all of those.
Even if they're polite. In fact, the politer they are and the more reasonable they are, the more likely they are to be deleted.
So, right. Narrative-driven games. What is and what isn't a narrative-driven game?
Well, it's the question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. What is a narrative-driven game and what is narrative in games? Because I don't necessarily think they're the same thing.
No, I don't either.
And so you can have games that ostensibly don't aim for narrative, but a narrative emerges. And then you can have games where their intention is to tell a story. And I'm often of the opinion that the former tell better stories than the latter.
The former being...
games where narratives emerge rather than games that have a prescripted narrative that you have to work with from the beginning.
Interesting. Okay. So the first thing is, yes, there is a difference between games that have a narrative element to them and narrative-driven games.
Yeah.
So let's go, first of all, to the end of the scale, which me and you really enjoy, the Euro games.
Right.
And let's pick games like Concordia, Great Western Trail, Underwater Cities. Right, now, for me, these fit into neither category. They are not games that have a narrative in them, and they're also not narrative-driven games.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's the nature of what we consider narrative, right? And I think these top-down Euro games that deal with... So if you want to put Concordia up against Agricola, mm-hmm. I think why Agricola tells stories in a way that Concordia doesn't is that Agricola deals with the individual, right?
Okay.
You're dealing with a particular family in a farm, and your struggle to just get them to eat resonates with you. Whereas Concordia is this big top-down thing. It feels more like history than it does story, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Because story is all about focusing on the individual, whereas I think Agricola can tell a wonderful story. I think Concordia is a wonderful game, but I'm not necessarily sure it tells a wonderful story. And I think that's a focus thing rather than a giving you flavor text telling a story thing.
Okay. So just taking on that a bit further, if we switch to Great Western Trail, which was another one that I mentioned, that is one individual travelling from A to B with a load of cows.
Now, I've never played that game, so I'm not sure what sort of narrative thing it delivers.
Well, that's it. I've told you.
Right. but I think there's this lazy sort of thinking that Euro games don't tell stories.
Right.
And I don't think that's true.
Most of them don't, but some of them...
I'm not sure. It depends. Do you feel like what you're doing? If you feel like what you're doing, and especially if you're put in the position... So if you look at Imperial, for instance, mm-hmm. I don't know if you've played it.
Yes. Big fan.
Imperial tells an incredible story. Its intention is to say to the player, look at the way our world is run, the corrupt way our world is run, and the lives of people will be mucked around with simply for financial gain. And you are one of these broad sort of disaster capitalists that are betting on the destruction of countries. That's an incredible story. That's a central human story about modern society. And, that's a game, I think, that has narrative baked into it. Now, it doesn't have a storybook that you read a story from, but that doesn't mean a story doesn't get told, right?
Right. So we're verging on to here, talking about whether a story is being told. And you could say that of all games. But as you say, you're much more likely to say, oh, you remember that game of Agricola when we were on turn 3 or 4 and I just couldn't get any clay and I couldn't build my house and then I was really struggling. That's a bit more memorable than, oh, do you remember that game of Concordia where I picked up those 3 Mars cards? Right. And I beat you by 3 points. It's like, there's no story in that, whereas Agricola, you're telling the story of a family living on a farm.
And I think that's all the time when people talk about Agricola, oh my God, it's so stressful to try and get food. I think part of that is literally, oh my God, it's so stressful to try and get food. Not because I get a beggar card and I lose 4 points, although that's certainly part of it, but it's also, I've got to feed my family. And that's such a universal it's something you can empathise with universally, even if you haven't experienced it, right? And I think that's why collecting Mars cards doesn't feel like narrative, but feeding your family does.
Okay. But it's interesting what you said about Imperial, because I wouldn't have said that Imperial tells any kind of story whatsoever, but you're saying that it does.
Yeah,
and you're
I think
right, and I'm wrong. So there we go. Right.
Well, I'm not sure anyone's right or wrong, but I think what Imperial's obviously satirical, and Imperial is telling a story, a cynical story of human corruption, which I think is sobering and interesting, and putting the players in the position of evil people doesn't mean the game is endorsing evil. What it's doing is pointing out that sometimes the world isn't a great place and there's things we need to change, right?
Yeah. I just don't feel... I mean, I've played it a bunch of times, and I've played its predecessor as well, or it's the sequel, Imperial 2030.
Yeah.
Same game, but yeah, slight tweak. I don't feel that a story emerges in those games, other than that it is a game where there are different nations and you will be responsible for controlling those nations as the game goes on. So you end up getting alliances between nations, not in the way that alliances normally work in board games, for example, Diplomacy or Game of Thrones or something like that, in that if you happen to be the majority shareholder in England and Germany, then England and Germany are currently allied because they will not be making moves against each other.
Right.
So, I guess you could, write that down as a story, but, having played the game quite a bit, I've not felt that... I just felt that I was playing a game. And whilst I enjoyed the game, and I thought it was interesting how different companies shifted their, partnerships and alliances, that there wasn't actually a story evolving during the game.
Well, I mean, I had this explained to me before I played the game, you see. Someone said this is this great work of satire, and it's, you're the evil people behind the countries manipulating their values. So clearly I was predisposed to think that while I was playing. I didn't come to the game cold. So maybe had I not been told that, I mightn't have picked it out. But when I did, I certainly felt that was really, really there and really biting and...
Which is good, because that helps with the immersion of the game. I don't think what you've said is actually in the rule book or on the back of the box. That's right. Whoever taught you, that's their interpretation. And it was clearly a good one. And it clearly, worked because it made you enjoy the game more. So, right, let's go to the other end of the scale. What is your number one narrative-driven game?
So are we talking here about games that are, obviously narrative games that have a story that you play through?
Yeah.
Well, up until recently, it was Descent, because I think Descent is great. Then it was Pandemic 1, because I didn't enjoy Pandemic 2 very much, but I thought the story in Pandemic 1, whilst quite generic, was really tight and really interesting and a load of fun, and I hadn't seen it before. But I think the game that delivers the most bang for its buck in delivering narrative, and narrative in beautifully crafted chunks, and might be the only board game that has half decent writing in, and that's Arkham Horror, the living card game for me. Which
is probably why I got you on the show, because that's currently my number one as well. But to be fair, there's very few, and this is probably what sparked the idea for this, is that I believe that the Arkham Horror card game, I mean, I'm a massive fan of it, as regular followers of mine in the last couple of months will realise. But it is very much a narrative-driven game. And I emphasise the word driven there. And let's go back to Descent. And I'm going to also insert Gloomhaven into this. Descent and Gloomhaven are scenario-based games where you will read some narrative at the start.
Right.
You will then play a game, and then you'll read some narrative at an end.
Right.
And whilst... And this is my thing, is are they narrative-driven games, or are they just something else? Whereas in Arkham Horror, you are revealing bits of the narrative as the game goes on.
Play, yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose Gloomhaven has that a little bit. Some of the doors are numbered, and when you open door number 2, read this little bit of text. But Arkham Horror is just, it's everywhere. It's everywhere you go. It's every location you go to. It's as the agenda advances, the act advances. You're reading bits of story as the game is being played. And you are having decisions to make during that.
And it integrates its story into literally every aspect.
Yeah.
The way you lay cards out on the table mirrors a map, for instance.
Yeah.
That you go into the scenario and you do different things per scenario. You look for different people. You extract different things. The conditions on how you get from a location to a location changes from scenario to scenario. And the scenarios are beautifully constructed and they're put together in such a way that also enables you to lose but continue, which is much more compelling as a story. You don't have to. So old computer games and some board games have sort of taken this, where you have to pass the level until you can get to the next level.
Yeah.
And that's not like narrative. That's not like a movie, right? The hero gets beaten up 2/3 into the movie and has to overcome that to eventually win. And Arkham Horror gives you that on every turn.
Yeah. And this is the other thing. So if we're going to touch on campaign-driven games like Arkham Horror, like Pandemic Legacy, like Gloomhaven, and things like this, one of the reasons why I love the Arkham Horror system, being aware of trying not to turn this podcast into purely why me and Ben love Arkham Horror.
Why not? It's brilliant. So.
Is the fact that they are fairly linear. So Pandemic Legacy Season 1, I played through it and I enjoyed it. Okay, and we enjoyed that story. It's 12 scenarios that you play in order, and whilst you don't have to replay one if you fail it, you just move on through the storyline. That storyline is not under your control. You will always do Scenario 2 next, and Scenario 2 will always be this. And then the twist that happens is great, and the story is great. And we can talk about it and say, oh, yeah. And it's like we both watched the same film, because exactly the same thing happened to us. Now, you'll manipulate that story in a tiny little way. Like, you might nuke Tokyo and we might have nuked, Los Angeles. But the overriding story is the same and we're all on the same journey.
Yeah.
Gloomhaven is a branching storyline, so you will not follow through the same scenarios in the same order, but each scenario has a win or loss condition. And if you don't win it, you go back in and you go and do it again. And then you have Arkham Horror, which is just amazing. It's,
I mean, Arkham Horror is a game that leads you through scenarios in order, but but it feels, in a way, and I haven't played Gloomhaven, so I don't know, but kind of in Pandemic, you kind of uncover most of the stuff. Whereas in Arkham Horror, there's a real tangible feeling of just scraping through, it being a failure. And it never feels like Pandemic. I love Pandemic, but Pandemic is a game where, depending on the cards, you can lose in 10 minutes. Or you can win in 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
And it never feels up against the wire in the way that Arkham Horror does. And it never feels like you're in the story in the way you are with Arkham Horror. I think, I don't know what it is, but I think there's 15, 20 years of Arkham games that have sort of been condensed and boiled down to this, for me, culmination of the Arkham Knights thing, which is the LCG.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what you have. Why it's so good is because they've had 20 years to build up to it, right?
Well, it's also, there's the story, which I think is fantastic, but the mechanisms within the game are a complete hybrid between, the Lord of the Rings adventure card game, the Warhammer Quest, the Lord of the Rings LCG, the Warhammer Quest adventure card game, which has recently been redone to Heroes of Terranoth. A lot of the combat mechanisms and the engagement and the threat area, that's all taken from that. The Netrunner action point system, where you can spend an action to draw a card or gain a resource, they've combined so many different things together, and I think that is the culmination of everything. But going back to the narrative driven, that's for me the number one narrative driven game, because there is story at the start, and every turn of a corner there is extra story that you read, and then there's extra story at the end. And I think every scenario, or most scenarios, have 4 resolutions. It's either 3 or 4. And you carry on playing through the campaign no matter which resolution you've got to.
Right.
And one of the resolutions could be horrendous, like all the characters were eliminated. But that then leads you down another path. And as you said earlier, it is linear. You know, the Dunwich Horror, you will do those 8 scenarios in order, except 1 and 2 can be alternated, but you still go through them in order. But where you are impacted by the decisions that you have made in previous ones and certain other things happening. So if you get resolution 3 from scenario 1, then that will tell you to write certain things in your campaign log, and then 4 scenarios later, that person we rescued, right, well, he's now come back to help us.
And they do that beautifully. And also, as I said earlier, I think, that what really singles Arkham Horror out is the writing actually isn't terrible.
It's brilliant, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much bad writing in board games. And so there are games that try to be narrative games and I don't think work. Perfectly serviceable, great fun, like sort of Above and Below and Near and Far.
Right.
I think they're actually great fun. I've had great fun playing both of them. But the writing's pretty terrible.
Okay.
And the narrative elements seem kind of tacked on. So basically, it's you read this paragraph and you roll a die, and you do that every time. Mm-hmm. And that's not how narrative works, right? Stories have to be different. It's not just... And you know, and I find this with Eldritch Horror too, games that try to introduce story, but when it's essentially paragraph of text, then resolve this action to see what happens, you'll inevitably find by sort of an hour in, everyone is just avoiding the flavor text and going to what you have to do. Yeah. And so what you're doing is actively excising the narrative from the game, whereas it should be so ingrained in the game itself that that's an impossibility, that it's intertwined with the mechanics, right?
Yeah. It's interesting because I've made a list of some games that we should talk about in this podcast. And Above and Below, I should have put on there, and I'd forgotten about that. I have played Above and Below once. And again, there are some people who will say, oh yeah, Above and Below is a great narrative game. And I've played it once, and like you, I played it, I enjoyed it. But at the end of the day, what it was I think you had a card, and then you rolled the dice, and that told you which paragraph to read. Right. So you would then, I'm reading paragraph 47, and you read just a very short paragraph of like, you're in a cave and there's some water and the noises are drip, this and the other. What do you choose to do? Do you want to fish for food, or do you want to try and find a way out? Oh, I'll try and find a way out. Right, okay, well, you've managed to find 2 bones and a what's it? And it's like, oh, right, okay. So it's like, was that a narrative game or not? Or was it just a game where they've inserted bits of storyline, which are self-contained bits of storyline that don't fit together in any bigger picture, to just, I don't know, make it a bit different?
Well, it's essentially it's a different way of resource gathering, right? Yeah. That's actually not particularly compelling after you've done it twice. Right. That's the problem. And the thing is with story is we're a pattern recognizing animal, so we need story to connect and to advance and propel itself. And a self-contained paragraph just isn't going to do that for you, and you're not going to end up eventually feeling like you've told any kind of story. You're going to go, that was a nice idea, but it didn't really work. Right.
Well, there's plenty of people out there who love Above and Below, and they love the narrative element of it, and for them that's great. But as you say, for people, for other people, me and you maybe, the fact that there's a little bit of flavor text that isn't connected to any other story, just tell me how many fish I get.
Flavor text doesn't tell you a story. It just doesn't. Flavor text isn't narrative. All it is atmosphere that essentially you ignore after a bit.
Right. Thank you for saying that, because I feel the same way, but I wasn't sure how to word it. I also believe that flavor text does not mean a game is narrative driven or adds any story. It's nice.
Or gives you any theme whatsoever, quite honestly.
Sometimes it gives you theme. And I'm going back to my old Magic the Gathering days here, where you play Gerard's Wisdom or whatever, and there's 2 lines of flavor text, and you say, oh, right, yeah, a little bit of theme there. But then you never ever read it again. You just go, play a card, gain 2 life for every card in your hand. But the flavor text on those cards it's a nice addition, and it adds to the sort of atmosphere and the setting and everything else, but nobody ever looks at it during a game. It's kind of like a secondary thing that's on there. And that's the thing with flavor text on cards, is that bit at the bottom of the card in italics is, you don't need to read this for the game to work. It's just literally flavor text. Whereas going back to Arkham Horror, the flavor text is actually part of, it isn't just at the bottom in italics, it's part of the whole resolution of the card.
It's mechanically integrated, and that's what it needs to be.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, there is a perfect way to deliver narrative in games, and they're called role-playing games. So
right.
All board games are kind of up against it if they're trying to deliver narrative, because there is a paradigm in which you can deliver narrative in a brilliantly compelling and also completely unexpected way. And that's what RPGs give you. So games need to really work hard. And part of that is making it absolutely integral to the gameplay. Because if it sits off to the side, you just ignore it. Because fundamentally, when you play games, actually, you're focusing on the interplay of the mechanics. And I think everyone is doing that at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what board games are.
Whereas in a role-playing game, your entire focus is not on, I'm going to play this game and try and win by getting the most points. It's, we're all here to play a role-playing game and experience the playing of the game together. So your whole focus is kind of different, and that lends itself more to the narrative driven, because you'll have players talking in character, you'll have a GM who's reading paragraphs of text or descriptions or whatever. So yeah, but you're right, with the last few years where we've gone with campaign games, legacy games and everything else, it's like there's a lot of board games that are sort of starting to want to become a little bit like a role-playing game, but not quite a role-playing game.
And I think that's admirable. I think Arkham Horror, for me, is the closest that's come to it. I mean, a game that you really like and I really dislike, I don't think does it at all. And primarily because the writing is dreadful, and that's Time Stories.
You've spoiled the joke I was going to make, but that's okay. I was going to say, and now let's talk about what is one of your favourite games of all time. And I was going to say Time Stories. But Time Stories is on the list to talk about. And the interesting thing with Time Stories, I love it in a way. And bearing in mind that Space Cowboys have been one of my clients before and might be again, I'm kind of a bit, I'm on that line of what I can say and what I can't say. But playing games with my significant other has always been very difficult. And Time Stories was one of the games which turned things around, because she loves playing it. And therefore it is very difficult for me to not enjoy playing the game when suddenly I found a game that she enjoys playing together. Yeah. Now, I agree that some of the writing is not great. Some of the translations have been not great, which has caused some of the writing to be even worse than it actually is. And I totally get your point of view that you put in one of your old podcasts about it, is that the designers have literally put things into the game, mechanisms into the game, designed to waste your time so that you kind of feel you're getting a better value for money out of it because it takes longer. Right. So I understand that. I'm not saying that I don't agree with it. I don't think it's as much of a problem for me, but this is one of the things. Is Time Stories a narrative-driven game?
Well, Time Stories is
whether you like it or not.
It's all it is story.
Yeah.
What I would contend is it's not a narrative-driven game, because I don't think it's a game particularly. I think it sits much more in the wheelhouse of Tales of the Arabian Nights,
which I hate.
Right.
Absolutely hate.
Because that's not a game either.
It's not a game.
That's just about accessing the writing. Yeah. And that's what Time Stories is. It's about accessing the writing. And I hate the whole having to go back and do things over again. I find that absolutely disastrous. But the point is, I think if you have a game that is so dependent upon text, the text better be good.
It better be good.
In Time Stories, it just isn't. The writing is just not very good, and that's my fundamental issue with the game.
Yeah, I mean, we enjoy the game because of the meta puzzle, not because of the actual, here's a puzzle that you need to solve to get through the door. Right, let's solve it. Not that kind of puzzle. But the meta puzzle of, we've done 2 runs. We're now about to do our 3rd run. We don't have much time. To get through that door there, we're going to need the key. Now, we know where the key is. The key's over there. But we can't get the key because we need to speak to him. And we can only speak to him if we've already got the Klingon translation device, which we need to go and get from over there. So, first of all, we go over there, speak to them, do that. Then we go... That. It's like an adventure game that we're having to piece together the order in which we do things. Now, here's an interesting thing which I found fascinating when somebody told me this. Somebody said that there was Time Stories was an abstract game.
Right.
And I'm like, what? No, it's not. There's loads and loads of narrative. And they went, right, forget the fact that there's a narrative, okay? Have locations labelled A, B, C, D, E, okay? And you go to location C and you get item number 13. And then you go to location E, and as long as you've got item number 13, you get the blue square.
Right.
And then you take the blue square and you take it to location 17, and because you've got the blue square, you can then access this. It's literally exactly the same game as the one I've just described with the fish and the key and everything else. It's exactly the same.
But aren't all games like that fundamentally?
Well,
you can strip it back and say, computer games, I've got a friend of mine who's a computer game programmer, and he was explaining to me sort of how that you have sprites and they have boxes, and it's where boxes hit each other and that produces effect.
Yeah.
I mean, if you strip everything down to its component parts, fundamentally, you could say everything is an atom. And you could logically frame it like that. But no, I mean, there is an underlying structure to Time Stories, absolutely.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make it an abstract game. I don't buy that.
No, it was an interesting... Yeah, he basically didn't enjoy the game because he felt there was no theme, no story, no narrative, and it was just a complete abstract game of going and collecting random... And I was like, well, if it was that, we wouldn't play it. I mean, me and Vicky both like the meta puzzle and working things out. The fact that it's set in ancient Egypt and everything else, or whatever, is a nice addition. Would we play the game if it didn't have that setting? Probably not, to be honest.
It's like saying Super Mario is an abstract game because it has an underlying skeleton in which the game mechanics are allowed to work in. It's not an abstract game. Absolutely not. But of course, it has underlying things that you can't see as the consumer, but that's the whole point. You have to cover up the skeleton with things that give you theme and give you story.
Yeah. And then the other game on my list to talk about is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective.
Right. Which I think in terms of delivering narrative is absolutely amazing. Mm-hmm. And it's that thing, is it a game? Because it offers you a win condition that's impossible to get, right? Well, it's not really defined as a win condition. And this is the common misunderstanding people have.
You
try telling any gamer this.
I know. I've been having these discussions for 30 years now.
So
you don't need to beat Holmes.
Right. But especially the first time you come to it, if you're a gamer, the first time you come to it, not me particularly, because I'm used to losing everything. But, I've played with people who will just go, and I'm like, should we go to this place? Because that'll give us some information. No, I think we should just go to the end. And it's like, but we're not playing the game. Yeah. We're not solving the mystery. No, but we've got to beat Sherlock Holmes.
Right. No.
And so I think it needs to remove that element, that gamey element from it, because I think it has the potential to ruin what is an absolutely brilliant game. Brilliant idea.
I've seen Facebook posts and forum posts literally for 20 years now of the game's too hard, we didn't beat Holmes, it's rubbish. And it's like, forget that. I mean, when me and Vicky play it, we go to as many places as we want to.
Absolutely.
So that we feel we've got a good picture of, because we want to get all the questions right. So we probably end up playing for about 2.5, 3 hours. We go to about 15 to 20 locations, and then we answer the questions. And sometimes we didn't. I mean, we do the score, but then we forget about it. So we probably get 3/4 of the questions right. We probably get a couple of bonus questions right, and then we might lose 50 points because we went to so many places, and we'll come out with a score of 30 or 40. Doesn't matter. Whatever. But, I mean, that game, if you said Time Stories is all narrative, Time Stories still has puzzles, dice rolling, combat, artwork, and everything else.
Really, really terribly integrated puzzles, dice rolling, combat.
Yes.
but nevertheless, it has.
But Sherlock Holmes is all narrative.
Yeah.
It's just word after word after word. Oh, there's a couple of pictures that you might get for like you found a piece of notepaper on the ground and it'll show you a picture of the notepaper. But it is all narrative. It's just all text.
But what's so brilliant about Sherlock Holmes is it's the way it feeds you that narrative. Because you have the newspaper that you've got to go through and find the relevant article and go, how does that connect? It gives you, it doesn't hold your hand and lead you through the narrative in the way the game wants you to do it.
Yeah.
Everyone comes at it from different directions and finds it in different ways. And I suppose that what Sherlock Holmes gives you, that even sort of Arkham Horror doesn't, is a sense of ownership over that story, because the direction you enter the story is completely unique to your group.
Yeah.
And that's incredible. And that's why the game is so fantastic, and it is so innovative, and this is why a game made in 1982 feels like it's revolutionary today, you know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if we go back over the last few years of some of my most memorable gaming moments, bearing in mind I'm a medium to heavy Euro game player, and that's my sweet spot, and that's what I love. My most memorable gaming moments in the last 2 to 3 years have been Time Stories games, a Sherlock Holmes consulting detective game, and a game of Arkham Horror.
Right.
And it's like, they're the ones that have stuck in my memory as memorable and good memories because of, you know, the what happened. I'm not saying what happened in the game was good. I mean, one of our most memorable Arkham Horror ones was where one of the characters was shooting an enemy, engaged with another character with a shotgun and drew the tentacle, and therefore missed, hit the character who had the enemy engaged with them and killed them.
Right.
And then we ended up in these woods and we couldn't find a way out because it was our lead investigator that had been killed who was the one good at finding clues. And it's like, that was memorable. Very memorable. Am I going to have those same memorable moments from Euro games? I'm just not.
Well, I don't necessarily agree. You're not going to be able to retell the story in such a way. That is definitely
right.
True.
Okay.
But one of my most memorable gaming experiences was last year, and we played a game of Concordia. And when the game ended, we all stood up from the table, and we just stood and we looked at the board, and you could see all of us were just sort of had that feeling of, my God, that was a great way to have spent the last 2 hours.
Right.
How satisfying was that? And it wasn't particular game beats or particular moments, but it was just something about the experience of playing that game was equally as memorable, but not in a story way. It's not a story you tell in the way that you do about Arkham Horror. But I mean, I think what's so wonderful about Sherlock Holmes is it's the true gateway game, I think.
Okay.
Because, you know, firstly, you have Sherlock Holmes. Everyone knows who Sherlock Holmes is. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it's the kind of game that is sort of instantly understandable. Yeah. And it instantly feels like you're doing what you're doing. You're sleuthing, you're looking at the map, you're looking through the newspaper, and all of this. And all of that is super intuitive to people who've never played a game before. Yeah,
it's interesting because I've just recorded my video log earlier on today, and in that I talk about gateway games and my definition of a gateway game. And I wouldn't have said Sherlock Holmes is a gateway game, much like I don't think Codenames is actually a gateway game, because I think Codenames, Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective, and what was the other game I picked? I can't remember. Ganz Schön Clever. In that they are great games that you can introduce to non-gamers, and non-gamers will be able to pick them up and play them easily. But I don't believe you can then go on from that to a Euro game. I don't think I mean, I guess you can.
I think what they do is, right, so it's like, because people don't associate me with being a sort of board gamey nerd when they first meet me, because people have a picture of what a board gamey nerd is, and I sort of don't fit into that. And then they'll go, Ben's into those weird board games. That's surprising. And then they'll say, so what are these weird board games then? And then if I play something like Sherlock Holmes with them, they'll go, that was amazing. All right, I'm now more predisposed to believe what they tell me with regards to other games. Right? You then don't pull out Madeira, because of course that's not going to work. But then you go on to something like Dogs of War, which is super intuitive and easy to play. And then slowly you allow people to enter the hobby. And that's the definition of a gateway game. Right,
yeah. I think I just have a slightly different definition. You're right in that it opens a door and says, look, this is the hobby, there's all these games available. I just don't think you can go from, I believe that games like Carcassonne, Ticket to Ride, Bear and Park, Azul, they're gateway games because they're light, they're accessible, but they introduce people into what modern gaming is. Whereas I don't think Ganchon Clever, Sherlock Holmes, and Codenames, whilst they're great and they're perfectly suitable for non-gamers, I don't think they are an introduction to what most other modern games are. They stand alone, but maybe they're a gateway to the gateway.
Right. Well, they're a gate. The definition of a gateway is giving someone an entrance into it. And the thing is, what I think of something, as I said, like Sherlock Holmes or now Detective from Portal Games, people are more, if they've had a brilliant experience, they're then more inclined to believe you when you recommend something else. Yeah.
And as you say, with Sherlock Holmes, you can get people round and you don't have to sit and talk to them for 20 minutes explaining rules, because non-gamers have a capacity of 3 or 4 minutes. With Sherlock Holmes, you're like, right, we're solving a case, there's the map, here's the newspaper, we go to locations and off we go.
Right, and you read the opening bit of text and instantly everyone knows what's going on, right?
Yeah, because the rules are, choose a location to go to, read the text, choose another location to go to, read the text, repeat until you've decided it's enough, get the questions. That's it. Yeah. Cool, right. Have we discussed all of the games that we were going to talk about? I think we have, pretty much.
Well, we haven't mentioned Holding On.
We haven't mentioned Holding On. That was it.
This may be something we disagree on, I think.
Yeah. So, I went into Holding On with... because I'd asked beforehand of, is this a game which is going to be suitable for me to play with my mum and dad? Slight mistake here. I meant to say Vicky and my dad.
Okay.
Based on the fact that Vicky likes narrative-driven games. She doesn't really like games. She likes the narrative-driven games. And I said, like Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective, time stories, things like that. And I was led to believe that this is a very narrative-driven game. And it was like, right, okay. So then we played Scenario 1, and we found that it wasn't a narrative-driven game. In our eyes. And I know I'm going to come in for some criticism on this, but there is a little bit of story that you read at the start. You then play a game, and then there's a little bit of story at the end. But in the middle, what you're doing is you're playing a game of drawing cards and trying to put them into a space in a grid to achieve the goal of the scenario. And
yes,
that's it. Now, the reason why I'm coming under some criticism is these cards, these dream cards or whatever that you're trying to put in, they have a little bit of flavour text on the back of them. And again, flavour text. But that flavour text is telling part of the backstory of the character because you're piecing together his memories. So the first time you play it, and probably the second time you play it, you're like, oh, what story are these images telling us? And you're trying to work out, oh, this is obviously a difficult time in his life when he was a kid and he looks like he's being bullied. And that was quite cool. But once you've done that 2 or 3 times, you're just going to go, which card is this? Oh, this is the card that goes in A2. Put it there. Right, what's this one? Oh, this is the card that goes in position B4. Put it there. You're not going to read that flavour text or really even look at the images in future games.
You see, I think I agree with you to some extent. I think Holding On's biggest failure is that you kind of feel like you're doing the same thing every game and it feels kind of disconnected to the storyline to some degree. But firstly, I applaud it wholeheartedly for what it's trying to do.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And secondly, I was playing it and this was 7 scenarios in, so, and there's one card where he stood there in his underwear and a pink t-shirt on the phone. And I just remember sitting there and I looked at this card and it hadn't sort of hit me before. And I just thought, firstly, it's such a potentially mundane image. But at the same time, I went off on this sort of spiral of thought about who's calling him. Is it joy? Is it his daughter telling him she's graduated? Is it his father telling him his mother's died? It could be any number of things. And to see a normal, podgy, middle-aged man in a stolen moment of life
in his pink underwear,
right, is so refreshing and exciting and so different from brandishing a gun or a magic wand or a staff, and I think Holding On is far from perfect, but I think its aspiration is to be hugely applauded, and I think it will be looked back upon as something that started a sort of new revolution in what stories in games are.
Yeah,
At
I
least
hope
that's
so. I
my
mean,
hope.
although I've got my opinions about the actual game itself, I have been talking about this game to everybody I can, because I've been trying to say, modern gaming is now gone in a way that we're getting games about actual real things. And I've been using Holding On as an example. And those 5 storylines that I think Rory actually came up with, those 5 storylines himself, and the artwork is just great. And I really like that. And when you're finding out about the character's backstory and his difficult life and you're piecing it together, that's great. But I don't think that's part of the actual game. The actual game itself was effectively a solo puzzle game of putting counters on a thing to do something and to try and meet the objective of the scenario, which is effectively getting all things in a particular row or things in the corners or whatever. So we played it, and then I spoke to Vicky and my dad afterwards, and it was like, and they were both expecting a bit more story and narrative, and the bit at the start and the bit at the end wasn't enough for them to actually want to play the game itself.
Right.
What I think Vicky's going to do is she's just going to sit and spend like 20 minutes reading the cards. She's just going to read all of the cards for the 10 scenarios so that she has the story without the 45-minute puzzle game in the middle of each one. And I can totally see where she's coming from with that. Whereas, as I say, I went into it thinking that there was going to be narrative during the game, rather than just at the start and the end.
And that's the thing. And I think the reason Pandemic Legacy works is because essentially it's the same in Pandemic Legacy, but you've got the cards that come out at certain points, and it's underpinned by one of the best board games that's ever been designed. So actually playing the game is not a chore either, right?
Right. Yeah. So, going back to what we were saying right at the start, definition of narrative games and narrative-driven games, it's up to you. It really is. We've both got our own opinions.
That's such a cop-out, and I admire you.
Well, I've got mine. I've said Holding On for me was not a narrative-driven game, and I've already come under criticism for that because people say it's all about the narrative, and I'm like, no, you've got a bit of story at the start and the end, and then you've got a puzzle game in the middle.
And I agree with you entirely on that.
Arkham Horror, I don't think it's any surprise that we both, have that at the top of our narrative-driven games. Pandemic Legacy we've talked about. Gloomhaven is an interesting one because, again, you've got the story at the start, you've maybe got a little bit of text when you open a door, then you've got the story at the end, but then you have a 2.5 hour, effectively a combat-driven tactical combat game in the middle, with the underpinning stories on either side. The thing with Gloomhaven, which keeps me loving it, is as well as the scenario, you have this living, breathing world with these road events and city events. So you actually have stuff going on in the world outside of your scenarios. And then you have other bits as well, which I can't talk about if you've not played it, which sort of impact on decisions that you make as well. There's definitely a narrative element to that.
Yeah, but I think people feel that it's beholden upon them to put narrative into games, and I don't think it's necessary. I think you can have a game without any sort of narrative whatsoever, and it function beautifully.
So give me a couple of games which have had narrative forced into them recently because it's the cool thing to do that you perhaps didn't think was the right thing.
Well, a game that's really good mechanically but tries to tell a story, and I don't think it needs to, is City of Kings, for instance. Because it doesn't need it. You don't need connected scenarios and things like that to make what is, a game of different scenarios function. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think of other games.
I felt the same. I've only played it a few times, but you're right. I mean, we played the scenarios, and City of Kings is interesting because it's a mix of quite a bit of randomness in certain areas, and then absolutely deterministic combat in other areas.
Yeah.
Which is basically a puzzle. How are we going to deal this amount of damage to the monster and not take damage back? Right. You're right, that scenario would be the same scenario with or without the bits at the front and the end. And a lot of the cards that come out have story text, move 3 fog counters 1 space to the left. And it's kind of like...
Exactly.
It would be the same game without it, but I know Frank put so much effort into the world building that he has created this world. You know, he's put all of that effort into there. So it's there for the people that want it.
Well, the beauty is, if you build the world and the world is consistent, then you don't need a story. The game can just inhabit that world and that's fine. City of Kings feels like it feels like a video game in the sense, you know, but it doesn't feel like a narrative video game. It feels like, again, you have a level, there are cutscenes, and then the next level is just a more difficult reiteration of what came previously, and that's fine, but you don't need a connecting story.
Okay. What about Mage Knight?
Now, I only played it briefly one scenario.
Okay.
And the scenario was great.
But this is the thing, Mage Knight doesn't have any flavour text on cards.
Right.
And Mage Knight scenarios, they don't, it's not really narrative driven. It's like, there's a load of druids, you've got to go and kill them, right? Off, and on with the scenario.
Yeah. I never felt like, I played it once and I never thought, ooh, what's going to happen in the next episode, even though I enjoyed the game. And I could play it again, and it's self-contained.
It's standalone scenarios, and there is no story, there is no campaign, there is no, flavour text or anything else, but the games do tell a story as you're going through them. Yeah. But it's one that's, come under some, a lot of discussion of, some people say, it tells a great story, and some people say it tells no story because it's got no flavour text on the card, and there's, the lack of narrative in that game doesn't hurt it whatsoever.
Well, you look at the best game that's ever been designed, and that's designed by the same designer as Mage Knight, and that's Through the Ages. Mm-hmm. Through the Ages tells a wonderful self-contained story every time you play it. And, maybe you have a very militaristic nation, or a very artistic nation, or a very scientific nation, or a strangely religious nation. And you chart the sort of ups and downs of your civilization as you go forward. But it never feels the need. And maybe they're planning that in the future, and I hope not.
No, they're not.
To have
there's no flavour text on cards, and there's no
to have linked games
mode.
and campaigns. I mean, it doesn't need it. It tells a wonderful story. And this is why, sometimes you want to watch a movie, sometimes you want to watch a series. And though they both deliver stories, they do it in a different way. And I guess the stories that Eurogames deliver are much more akin to self-contained filmic stories, and the stories that things like Arkham Horror deliver are much more akin to a TV show, and you buy an episode of a TV show and play it.
Yeah. I know 2 of the games that came out last year that I did reviews of, and I quite liked these games, but one of the things that I said in my reviews is that I was fairly critical of the fact that they seem to force a story mode into them, because that's the cool thing to do. So Blackout Hong Kong by Alexander Pfister.
Okay.
I really like the game, apart from the graphic design. The game's really good. But then it comes with this campaign mode at the back, and it was like, campaign mode. And it's like, okay. And it tells literally 2 lines of a story. It's 10 o'clock, the power's gone out, and Dave's gone missing. Right. Now play a scenario with this slight tweak to the setup rules. And that's it. Right, scenario 2. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, we've found Dave and he's lost his shoe. Now play this scenario with this following tweak to the setup rules. And it's like, what? This isn't a campaign, this isn't a story. This is just, here are 5 slight tweaks to the setup to give you a slightly different play experience.
Well, I just played The Taverns of the Deep Valley, right? Wolfgang Warsch's new game. And it has like a basic game, and then it has 3 or 4 modules that you can add to it that come in. Now, they could have very easily said, this is a story about how the taverns are becoming more and more advanced through history. And thankfully, they didn't. They just said, these are modules, these are optional modules you can put in or leave out to make the game more complicated.
Yeah.
So don't wrap up dog feces and tell me it's chocolate, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, Reichholtz was the other one. Where the game came with 8 variant scenarios, but they called them story mode. And I'm like, really?
They're variants, they're modules, and that's great.
They are, and that's what they are. But they're not really a story. But it's because, story modes and campaign modes are the big thing. And yeah, it's just I don't want everybody to start forcing it into games where it's not really needed and it doesn't really fit.
And you hurt yourself, I think, fundamentally. Because I think if people go, oh, story mode, and then they have the reaction you had to Blackout Hong Kong, you feel worse about the game than you would have if it just said, this is a variant, this is a
variant, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, right, okay. We've been chatting for a while. It's been good to talk to you. I hope it's been interesting for people to listen to. And if you have any thoughts on anything that we've been saying, then I will put a link to my BGG Guild in the show notes, and I'll start a thread about this for everybody to go on and basically start disagreeing with what we're saying. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll just delete all of them and we'll only keep the ones where people agree with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Thank you very much for giving it your time. Just a quick reminder for people where they can find you.
Yes, so on Twitter, I'm at 5 the number games, 4 the number Doomsday. You can go to 5gamesfordoomsday.com, and that's written like the words. And there you can find every episode I've done, every review I've written, and there's loads of great stuff there.
Yes. And people should know where they can find me. But yeah, Gaming Rules videos in most places, except where I'm not allowed to use the words videos because it's too long. So it's Gaming Rules Vids. And there we go. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me, and I will speak to you soon.
An eternal pleasure, Paul.
And that's everything. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the show. And as mentioned at the start, this podcast and a lot of the other content that I create would not be possible without the support of my Patreon campaign. So if you do enjoy the content that I make, then please consider supporting me over at patreon.com/gaming rules. Thank you very much to Ben for being a guest on the show. Thank you very much again to Games Law, the UK's largest specialist games retailer at gameslaw.com. Thank you very much to the support of the Board Game Trading and Chat UK Facebook group. And Gaming Rules is a member of Punchboard Media, where we all bring something to the table. And a final thank you to Jason Shaw at audionautics.com for the music used in this podcast. Until next time, take care, and thanks for listening.